I love Dungeons & Dragons, and it has a wealth of weapons available to players, but I think that they can be a bit lacking when it comes to variety. Don't get me wrong, some of the weapons are well designed to offer players choices that will impact combat, but then there are others like the Morningstar and Warpick, which stats-wise are exactly the same. I've done what I can to try and improve this using some homebrew mechanics for the piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning damage types, as well as a complete redesign of how weapon proficiencies work and some changes in stats and properties for individual weapons. Also, be sure to check the description if you'd like to see a PDF I've made with all of these rules in the same formatting as the Dungeons & Dragons sourcebooks. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the damage types. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, all non-magical damage can be categorised as slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning, depending on where it comes from. This is a good system to start with, but it's not really been utilised because there's a very little difference between these three damage types. The only effect it has is in the form of some enemies having resistance or weakness to one of them, but this is very rare. In fact, most creatures that have resistance or weakness to weapons are affected by all non-magical damage in the same way. This can help separate magical damage from non-magical damage, but doesn't help the damage types feel different from one another. So, in order to try and improve this, I've added a set of rules for each damage type, most of which are going to revolve around whether or not a target is wearing hard armour. To clarify what that means, I'm counting any medium or heavy armour as hard armour, but the Dungeon Master will have to use their best judgment when deciding what natural armours are counted as hard. For example, I would say that a dragon's scales are hard armoured, but not all of them are as straightforward. It's important to keep track of what is hard armour and what isn't when using these rules, because weapons of different damage types are going to have noticeably different attack bonuses and potential damages depending on what they're being used against. Now, the first damage type is slashing, which will feature weapons that do slightly more damage than the other types. In addition to the damage bonus to all enemies, slashing weapons cause bleeding damage when used against enemies that are not wearing hard armour. Bleeding damage causes the target to lose an additional amount of HP at the start of their next turn. This is determined by rolling a dice equal to twice the attacker's proficiency bonus. So, for example, if a level 2 fighter attacks something, the target will take normal damage, then on its next turn will take an additional d4 damage due to the fighter's proficiency bonus being +2. This system means that the range for bleeding damage will be from a d4 to a d12 as the proficiency bonus increases over the levels. After the target has suffered damage from the bleeding effect, it will go away. It can also be removed early through healing or patching it with a medicine check, but obviously this would have to be done by someone else prior to the target's turn in order to avoid the damage. A creature can only have one bleeding effect on it at a time, even if multiple attackers are able to cause bleeding. This effect is going to work for monster attacks as well as player attacks, as are the ones for all the other damage types. But monsters don't have their proficiency bonuses recorded in the stats block, so you're going to have to work it out yourself. This can easily be done by taking the creature's attack bonus and working backwards, removing its ability score bonus to get the proficiency. The main drawback of slashing weapons is the difficulty they have when coming up against opponents in hard armour. The mechanics for this will be in the form of a penalty to your attack bonus when using slashing weapons against a hard armoured opponent. In this case, the player may not add their proficiency to the roll. At lower levels, this will make slashing weapons less effective against hard armour, but still usable, whereas at higher levels there will be some hard armoured opponents that simply can't be hit by anything but a critical, meaning that using a range of weapons will become more necessary as the game progresses. Moving on from slashing, we have bludgeoning, which will be acting as a sort of anti-armour weapon, as they did in real life. Bludgeoning weapons will generally not do as much damage as their slashing and piercing counterparts, but they do get to use their full attack bonus as normal, even when fighting opponents wearing hard armour. They also receive an effect called kinetic damage, and it allows for an attack against a hard armoured opponent that misses by 2 or less to count as a successful hit, but only at half damage. The combinations of these abilities make bludgeoning the sort of safety weapon. It is the best chance of consistently hitting hard armour, and can still hit unarmoured just as well, but the weapons will also do slightly less damage to opponents. Finally are piercing weapons, which will be acting as a high-risk, high-reward sort of option. First of all is an increased chance to crit, which allows for all piercing weapons to land a critical hit on a 19 or a 20. This effect does stack with things like the champion's improved critical, so having both would move that value to an 18 or up. Piercing melee weapons will also be permitted to use their full attack bonus against hard armoured opponents, much like bludgeoning weapons are, but with the added drawback of the weapons having a chance of getting stuck in the armour. When you land a successful hit on a hard armoured opponent, you must roll a d6, and on a 3 or less the weapon becomes stuck. If you land a critical hit, you don't need to roll and your weapon will not become stuck. In the event that your weapon does become stuck, you must spend an action pulling it free before you can use it again. This adds to the high risk, high reward design of piercing. You do less base damage than slashing, but have a higher chance to get a critical and as such do more. You also may hit hard armoured targets just like bludgeoning, but there's a risk of you losing your weapon. This effect also means that carrying backup weapons will prove more beneficial, as you could abandon a stuck piercing weapon and use something else instead of trying to retrieve it right away. Overall, the point of these changes is to try and make it so that your weapon choice matters. You can still have weapons to specialise in, but it's going to prove more beneficial to bring a range of weapons to fight the different armour types that you may run into. These changes will generally increase damage output, but as the effect will be in place for both players and monsters, it's going to balance out. Another effect these abilities will have is it's slightly increasing the protective capability of heavy and medium armour in comparison to light armour. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it's only a slight increase, so I think it's fine, but I'm going to go into armour balancing in more detail in a future video that will be more focused on that topic. So with the new rules for damage type sorted, I wanted to go over my new system for weapon proficiencies that will incorporate them. The purpose of these trees are to allow people to specialise a bit more in certain areas, and make the differences between some weapons more noticeable. So instead of your class telling you which types of weapons you're proficient in, you will be given an amount of weapon points depending on what you're playing. These points can be spent on tiers of weapon proficiency in various trees, or to buy an ability that affects weapons from that tree. So to demonstrate this point, I'm going to first show you the standard slashing weapons tree to show the structure, and then I'll go through every tree and cover the changes I've made to certain individual weapons. As you can see with this tree, there is the simple tier, which must be purchased in order to purchase the martial tier or the ability tier. However, the martial tier isn't needed in order to buy the ability. Buying a tier gives you proficiency in all the weapons that the tier contains, as you would expect, and buying the ability gives you a unique ability that will only affect the weapons within this tree that you're proficient in. So hopefully that makes sense, and I can now go through each of the trees and talk about what separates them from one another. The first thing to mention is basic weapons, which don't fit the usual structure as every class is proficient in these weapons from the start. They contain the dagger, quarterstaff, club, dart, sling, blowgun, and net. Now for some actual proficiency trees, I will cover the 3 standard damage type trees first. I'm not going to list everything I've done because I'm going to show them on screen, but I'll go over the ability and some of the weapons that have gotten relevant changes. The first damage type will be bludgeoning. As you can see, bludgeoning weapons generally do less damage than the others, but thanks to the previous rules will be better against hard armour. This effect is amplified in the proficiency ability, which allows for a successful hit against hard armour with a weapon from this tree to reduce the target's AC by an amount equal to your proficiency bonus. This effect remains until the armour is repaired by anyone who is proficient in it or a relevant skill or tool. It takes about 30 minutes to do. This effect cannot be used on the same creature twice until their armour is repaired, even if the second attack is coming from a different person to the first. So, in other words, the effect does not stack. The effect can also only trigger on a full hit, so doing some kinetic damage with a close miss cannot dent the armour. This ability makes the bludgeoning weapons in the tree even more effective against armour, but now you can also create openings to allow other members of your party to hit the target easier as well. Moving on to the next tree, we have slashing. As you can see, most of the weapons are set to do slightly more damage than bludgeoning. Mostly this is through multiple smaller dice, meaning that they will do more damage on average, as well as additional damage from the bleed effect. There aren't really any changes beside that other than the ability, which improves the bleed effect for weapons in this category. The bleed effect no longer disappears after it has dealt damage, and instead remains, dealing additional damage every turn until the target is patched up with a medicine check, healed, or falls to 0 HP. This allows you to be even more devastating against opponents incapable of healing or patching themselves up, but the effect will still only work against opponents that are not wearing hard armor. Now, the third of the damage type trees we have is Piercing, which has weapons that deal damage numbers vaguely between bludgeoning and slashing, but of course this is increased slightly when the extra crit chance is taken into account. In this tree you will notice I've added an entirely new weapon called the Horseman's Pick. This is essentially a heavy two-handed variant of the War Pick, and its full stats are on screen. In real life they were mainly used on horseback, hence the name, and that's something I may explore in a future video, but for now it will function in a similar way to the other two-handed weapons. For the ability, players can give themselves an increased skill when it comes to freeing weapons. In addition to the guaranteed removal at the cost of an action, players can also use a bonus action to attempt a quick removal. To do this, they make the same roll as is made to check if a weapon has become stuck, a d6, and on a 3 or below, the weapon remains stuck. Anything higher and you have successfully freed it. This adds to the luck-based playstyle of piercing melee weapons, allowing you to avoid losing your action or losing the weapon if you get the rolls you need. So those three are acting as sort of core damage type trees, but there are two more melee trees that I've designed. Adaptive, which will contain swords, and Thrust, which will be things like spears. Starting with Adaptive, the most relevant thing you will see is the different damage numbers for each weapon, linked with different damage types. This is because all weapons in this category can be used to make slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning attacks. Much like how in real life, swords can stab, slash, and be held by the blade to cause bludgeoning. Which sounds insane, but it really was a strategy used to fight opponents wearing heavy armour. This means that the swords are allowed to benefit from the damage type effects that were outlined earlier. The catch to this is that swords will do slightly less damage than weapons that are focused on one damage type. So swords give you great versatility and can be a good move if you're only planning on bringing one weapon, but will be slightly less effective at any one thing that it does. The sword's ability is also going to act as a reward for taking a risk, as it can only be used when performing a piercing strike. When you perform a piercing strike using a weapon from this tree that you're proficient with, you may choose to perform a half-sword strike. This gives you advantage to hit, and on a critical you receive no penalty. But if you only achieve a successful hit, your damage is reduced by half, and if you miss the target, it is instead counted as a critical miss, prompting an opportunity attack. So this ability will allow you to increase your chance of getting a critical, but if you don't, you will have worse results than if you just made a normal strike. Because this ability can only be done with a piercing strike, it also means you have a higher chance to hit a critical, but if you hit a hard armoured target and you don't get a critical, your weapon may become stuck, making the bad situation even worse. Finally, we have thrust weapons. The first change I've made is to spears, which I've now categorised as martial, and given the finesse trait. I've done this because it works better for this proficiency layout, but also because it just makes sense to me that a spear would need as much training as a sword or axe. It also makes sense to me that spears can be used in a fighting style based around dexterity. In my head it's similar to what we see with Oberyn Martell in Game of Thrones. The next thing you will notice is the new weapon I've added called the Bector Corbin, also known as the Crow's Beak. This weapon has a blunt hammer as well as a piercing spike, allowing for it to be used as either damage type. The halberd works in the same way, only with piercing and slashing instead. I've intentionally made it so that there isn't a thrust weapon that does bludgeoning and slashing, because I want that to be a unique perk of swords. The final change to weapons is the pike, which does slightly more damage than the halberd and Bector Corbin, and has a new trait called Long Reach, which works the same as Reach, only it adds 10 feet instead of 5. Now for the ability, which gives you a new move you can use whilst wielding a weapon in this category called Excessive Strike. You can activate the strike as an action, allowing you to start spinning your weapon around you. Whilst the effect is active, you have a +2 to armor class, but your movement speed is reduced to 5 feet. You can cancel the effect as a free action on any turn, or if you are within melee range of a target, you may spend an action to make a charged attack, which also ends the effect. When you make a charged attack, if you hit the target, it is instead counted as a critical, and if you score a critical, you may remain charged, allowing you to make another charged strike next turn if you wish. So those are all the proficiency trees for melee weapon types, but there are also ranged weapons. Currently, the main types of ranged weapons are crossbow and bow, so I've made a tree for each of them separately, even though they are both piercing. Ranged weapons will still receive the bonus to critical due to being a piercing weapon, but have a different set of rules when it comes to hard armor, the same way as slashing weapons do. I did this for balancing purposes, because it seems too powerful if any bow is able to pierce armor, due to there being no downside to arrows or bolts getting stuck in armor. There are some exceptions which I will cover when they come up. First of all will be bows. The first tier brings the short bow, which I've changed to allow for multiple shots to be fired at once, allowing you to potentially shoot up to 3 targets at the same time. You could also shoot all 3 at one person, but you still have to roll separate attacks for each arrow. This means the potential is there to do solid damage, but it requires things to go your way. The other drawback is that it's incapable of piercing hard armor, and can only damage targets that wear it if it scores a critical. There is also the warbow, which acts like a beefed up version of the longbow, only it has the added benefit of being able to penetrate armor, meaning it can use its full attack bonus when fighting hard armored opponents. Finally, the longbow is now able to fire 2 arrows at once, using similar rules to the shortbow. The ability for bows gives you the ability to fire additional arrows. If you use the attack action with a bow, you may use your bonus action on the same turn to fire an additional arrow. If you're using the shortbow, you instead shoot 2 extra arrows. Then we have crossbows, starting with the hand crossbow and light crossbow, which remain pretty much unchanged. However, the heavy crossbow is given the trait armor piercing, meaning that much like the warbow, it's able to use its full attack bonus when fighting hard armor. The heavy crossbow also has the trait slow loading. This works like standard loading trait. You must spend a bonus action to reload, but now you must roll to see if the weapon jams. You need to roll the d6, and on a 3 or less, the weapon is jammed, and you must try again before being able to use it. Alternatively, you can spend a full action to reload the weapon without any risk of jamming. The ability for the crossbow tree allows you to fire 2 shots from your weapon before it needs reloading. This doesn't increase the amount of shots that can be fired in a single action, however. You'll notice that some weapons from the handbook have been removed here. The sickle, whip, flail, and trident. Mainly because stats-wise, they aren't really needed. The trident in particular is exactly the same as the spear. The weapons I've kept in are acting as a kind of baseline, which can be used to create other weapons, if you want something that isn't there. For example, one of my players wanted a scythe weapon, so I created a variant based on the glaive stats. That's all of the weapon trees I had so far, but I have plans to expand on some ranged weapon mechanics in a future video. The last thing I'm going to cover is how weapon proficiency points are allocated. As I mentioned earlier, weapon proficiency points can be spent on weapon tiers and abilities, costing 1 point each. And in order to purchase a martial or ability tier, you need to first purchase the simple tier in that tree. I've split the classes in the player's handbook into 4 groups, which you can currently see on screen. The way I decided on these groups was based on what they currently started on. So Group 1 is made up of classes that begin with less than simple weapons. Group 2 contains classes that begin with just simple weapons. Group 3 has classes that have simple weapons and some extra weapons, and then the final group contains classes that know simple and martial weapons. I'm bringing up these rules as well as showing you the classes because there are other things that could change this. For example, being a war domain cleric gives proficiency in martial weapons, so in this case it would give you an additional 3 proficiency points to use. There is also the additional rules that none of the classes from groups 1 or 2 can buy abilities or martial tiers with their starting proficiency points. The feat Weapon Master will also now give you 3 proficiency points instead of the usual 4 weapons. That's pretty much everything I have on this. As I've mentioned throughout the video, I have future content planned covering things like ranged weapons, armour, and things like injury and disease. So be sure to subscribe if that interests you. Overall, I found that these new mechanics have sped up combat, which I know some people will like, but also did achieve the main thing I was setting out for. With the new system, weapons are not equally capable against all enemies, and there is a real benefit to bringing a range of weapons to use against different opponents, which is exactly what I wanted.